Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Throughout the 19th century, the empires of Britain and France had held long-held ambitions to dominate the Middle East. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, the victorious imperial powers could finally accomplish their goal. France, which already had substantial territories in North Africa, took Syria and Lebanon. Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine came under British dominion. To talk about these issues, our guest today is the historian James Barr, a visiting fellow at King's College London. His book, A Line in the Sand, chronicles the ensuing rivalry between the two powers as they each vied for influence in the region they divided up between them. In his 2018 follow-up, Lords of the Desert, he picks up where he left off in the 1940s. France, more or less gone from the region, had been replaced by the United States. But if the British had hoped for a more pliable ally, they were to be disappointed. Instead, yet again, the British found themselves locked in rivalry in the Middle East with a power they had once considered an ally, one which would have an important hand in their ultimate withdrawal. James Barr, welcome to the podcast.
Faisal, thank you for having me.
Both of these books tell the story of great powers seeking to dominate the Middle East. So I suppose my first question has to be why? Why are imperial powers so determined to control the region?
That is a really good question. And in a sense, it's actually what I'm now working on for my next book, which is going to be called The Arena. Because this isn't, of course, the first time this happens. You can go right back in time, say, to the Parthians and the Romans, in the sort of early BC or just before Christ, and see similar dynamics happening. There over time, there are constant clashes between powers that are outsiders to try and dominate this part of the world. And I suppose it boils down ultimately to the fact that this is, it is the center of the world. It's the center for historically for so many civilizations. There are resources there that people have wanted to command. And certainly by the turn of the 20th century, both Britain and France felt that they sort of needed to be there. It was part of I think a sense that they derived prestige from it. Really, that was what mattered, even before oil. And oil wasn't really a factor right at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, so there's a kind of political logic to it. And I suppose that there's almost a kind of cascading logic to empire in general. I mean, as you say, the British and the French were looking at this region and thinking to themselves, if we are to be the dominant power, which they are rivals among themselves, we need to be there in some form.
That's right. I mean, one of the things it helps, and in a sense, I've only really realised this since writing A Line in the Sand, but it helps to see the British as an Eastern power. So when you're thinking about this rivalry between Britain and France, the French, of course, had first tried to get a foothold there. Well, I suppose you could say during the Crusades, but let's fast forward on to the end of the 18th century and Napoleon. Napoleon invaded in 1798. He invaded Egypt and then, advanced into Syria, where he found he couldn't take the Crusader port of Acre and had to retire. But that's critical because that was the French trying to make their way to India, which of course by that point the British dominated. And it's India that explains Britain's interest in the Middle East at the turn of the 20th century, because their big concern after they lost the colonies in America at the end of the 18th century was that India was the jewel in the imperial crown, and it was protecting that from all comers, and that included both the enemy in the First World War, Second World War, but also their allies, the French and the Russians in both world wars, but particularly they were thinking, what happens when we win, assuming we win this war, we are going to have to keep these people out of it, and that is the key to understanding what the British were about.
But why do you think it? So okay, so you think of them as an Eastern power, and then I suppose in that, if you're using that metaphor, what would the French be? Would the French be the Western power?
The French are effectively the Western power in this. They, as you absolutely rightly said, had a developing empire in North Africa. They felt that to control that better, it might be, or it would be valuable to control Damascus. In fact, they felt that it would enable them to control Islamic politics better. Now, how much that was just a justification for another land grab, I'm not certain, but it certainly was a vein of their thinking. And so that's why they were keen to get a toehold in the Eastern Mediterranean again.
So okay, you have the French coming in from North Africa, and you have the British trying to protect their protectorates east of Aden, and then they kind of clash over the Levant. But I wonder why you think it took them so long to get to that point, because throughout the 19th century, these powers had made no secret of their interest in the region, certainly in India. But at the point at which you begin the story, the Middle East was probably the only region in the world not yet dominated by European colonial powers. It was the world's last holdout against European colonialism. So why had it taken them so long to kind of converge on that region?
I think it was an uncertainty, a caution about what would happen if the Ottoman Empire collapsed. So the the uncertainty, that the sort of calculation that determines a lot of what happens between Napoleon and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, so that 100-year period from 1815 to 1915, is this uncertainty of uh, the basic belief is the Ottoman Empire is going to collapse, but we don't want to force that to happen because we don't know whether we'll get a good deal out of what comes. We cannot predict the outcome of the implosion of the Ottomans. And
Yeah.
so, although the British thought that the French were trying to blow up the Ottoman Empire, and I think the French thought likewise, the truth was that neither side was, nor the Russians as well from their corner. Everybody was sort of manoeuvring and trying to establish power within the sort of weakness of the Ottoman Empire.
Like to
But
try
of
to
course,
pull pieces of the empire apart, but not to let Sublime Porte break apart.
exactly, and so you see the French and the Russians very much trying to use the sort of religious influence to and the religious institutions they either controlled or were very close to try to acquire more influence within this sort of declining mass.
Yeah.
The British didn't have quite the same. They didn't have the same. Frankly, they didn't have the same um, levers in the Ottoman Empire. They did. I mean, they had some presence in Iraq, but the French were actually much better established there at that point in time. But of course, the onset of the First World War, the fact that the Ottomans joined the Germans changed that calculation, and so the British flipped from a position of saying, well, we support the Ottoman Empire to thinking about what would succeed it, and of course that is where then Britain and France find themselves in in a much more confrontational situation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it in terms of modern day politics. And they didn't have such a thing as regime change. But I guess if they had, it would have been better to change the regime in Istanbul rather than to get rid of the whole empire.
Well, they certainly, I mean, they tried to reform it repeatedly, or that's what they said they were trying to do. But yeah, it wasn't quite the same thing. Although there was that there was interest in the local politics. I suppose you could argue that, say, British or French support for Mehmet Ali in Egypt was a sort of form of regime change in a sense, or at least it was edging towards the point where they would well destabilize the Sublime Porte, but they didn't want to quite make that final step. Not until 1914.
Yeah, and it was World War One that finally gave them that opportunity. And actually, the line in A Line in the Sand is the one dividing British conquests and French conquests in the former Ottoman Empire, as set out in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So, I guess that's the place to start. But for listeners who don't know, perhaps you could give a brief overview of what the Sykes-Picot Agreement was.
At its simplest, it was a secret deal to carve up the 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 Middle Eastern, the Levantine part of the Ottoman Empire between France and Britain, so there was a diagonal line drawn, and in Sykes's infamous words, this was to run from the E of Acre to the last K in Kirkuk. And north of that line, the territory would go to France, and south of that line, the territory would go to Britain. Now, there were distinctions within that territory, but broadly, the assumption on both sides was that the French would control the territory to the north and the British to the south. There was one fly in the ointment, though, and that was the future of Palestine, which the two men, Sykes and Picot, the British and French negotiators, couldn't agree about. And so they reluctantly came to the view that it would have an international administration. And that's probably the most important longer term sort of factor about the Sykes-Picot agreement, and its major, I say, failing, or clearly the whole thing was can be argued to be a failure. But the point was that then, because the British particularly didn't like what was going on there, that led the British then to speak to the Zionists immediately, no sooner than the ink was dry on the deal. And so the Balfour Declaration, which follows the year after, is the direct successor and consequence of the failure of the British to get Palestine in the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
So that was because the British at the same time had been having multiple conversations with people in the region about what the division would be. So they were talking to the Hashemites about this greater Arab state. They were talking to the Zionist movement about what happened to Palestine. They talked to the Kurds as well. What was the division between the British and the French over Palestine? The British they did eventually promise it to the Zionist movement. But what were the French intending for it?
The French wanted it for themselves because they saw themselves as the protectors of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and that was a privilege that they had been given by the Ottoman Sultan, I think in the 16th century, if I remember rightly. And it was something they held on to precisely because of the influence that it gave them in Ottoman politics and in that part of the world, and the prestige that came with it. That was, that mattered to them. And so that was what they wanted, and they were determined to get it. But on the other side, the British saw this in a much more sort of geopolitical terms. They really wanted, well, again, the phrase that Sykes used was built of English-controlled country, and so the British wanted this cordon sanitaire across the region from Egypt, which they controlled since 1882, right up to the Iranian frontier, to keep France and Russia as far away from India as possible.
And so actually, I mean, you said that the Sykes-Picot line was a failure, but actually it's proved surprisingly endurable for listeners who don't have access to a map. If you look at that line, which they drew from Acre in what is now Israel to Kirkuk in what is now Iraq, it actually goes directly across the southern border of modern day Syria. So it pretty much follows the contours of Jordan, of Syria, and let's say 2/3 of Iraq, because the Kirkuk is below Mosul, which eventually is now in Iraq, but wasn't then.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you say, it has endured, and the vestiges of the deal can be seen in that strange diagonal line. But it was quite an old-fashioned deal even when it was done. So those sorts of straight line deals, of course, if you look at a map of Africa, you can see these sorts of lines everywhere.
Yeah.
But of course, by the time that the First World War ended, the thought was of self-determination, of trying to create borders that allowed for peoples different to sort of separate, but to create sort of national identities. So this sort of carve up already looked a pretty old-fashioned arrangement. And of course, when the Americans found out about it, when they entered the war, they were very, very skeptical, to put it mildly, about what had been going on behind their backs.
I mean, we talk about these lines, and as you say, they become quite familiar from the modern day borders because we sort of get used to how they look on the map. But actually, these borders, they didn't reflect any pre-existing political division. They didn't follow any geographical contours. They didn't take any account of what was happening on the ground. They were literally just lines.
It was absolutely. I mean, if you see the original map, which is there's two copies. There's one in France and one in the UK. The British one's at the National Archives in Kew in South London, and it's done with a colour pencil and freehand. It's really quite an extraordinary document to see.
Extraordinary. I mean, the entirety, a century of people's lives, of business, of politics, of relationships, just decided by the stroke of a crayon.
But I think you have to sort of understand what this was really about. And in a sense, it wasn't about drawing a frontier. Everyone knew that you didn't draw frontiers in that way, or you would send out parties of surveyors and they would pile up stones and whitewash them and look at watersheds and all that sort of stuff. But the point is, the reason for the Sykes-Picot Agreement has nothing to do with the Middle East. It's all to do with the rather terrible state of Anglo-French relations at that point in the First World War, where the war wasn't over by the Christmas 1914. It had gone on. The French had lost far, far more soldiers fighting than the British had, because the British had said, well, we want to save ourselves, we need to train up a new army, which of course was eventually unleashed at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But all through this time, the British are very conscious that they weren't really pulling their weight, and the French were getting more and more annoyed about that. Meanwhile, the British thought, well, perhaps to break this deadlock on the Western Front, we open a new front. We could attack the Ottomans, who look like the weak link, and potentially we could knock them out the war and open a new front in Southeast Europe that will force, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, to divert effort away from the Western Front and change the balance of force.
Yeah,
that was what was going on. But as soon as the British mentioned that, as soon as they mentioned the Gallipoli idea, the French were instantly suspicious, because they thought empire. The first thing they thought was that Britain was not in particularly. Britain had sort of lost interest in the war, or had slightly lost focus, and was now thinking about empire building. And so this deal, the Sykes-Picot deal, was necessary to allay French concerns, but it was a bit of a sticking plaster. It was a way of getting a deal on a piece of paper, and I don't think either Sykes, well, certainly I don't think Sykes and probably not Picot either, really felt that diagonal line that they'd drawn on the map in red and blue crayon was going to be, a frontier in the future. The strange thing, I suppose, is that it did turn out to be.
Yeah, ironically, I mean, so many countries still use those exact same borders.
Yeah, exactly.
When we talk about it in these abstract terms, I mean, it can come across as being very cordial, but that is something that you make very clear in the book, that it was nothing like that. But when we talk about the French and the British being allies, actually you're papering over a rivalry that was so intense that it almost just fell short of direct confrontation.
Well, and particularly after the First World War, yes, because neither side, neither the British or the French, really wanted the other one there as their immediate neighbour, and the British initially did all they could to really make the job of the French harder, and the British, of course, had done most of the fighting in the Middle East during the war, and they kept their troops there until a point where they realized they just couldn't afford to keep troops there anymore, and then very abruptly withdrew, leaving the French to pick up the pieces and to deal with incipient, Arab anger, Arab nationalism that had built up a head of steam because of the promises that Britain had made to the Arabs during the war to get them to rebel against the Ottomans.
Yeah.
But the French were left dealing with the outcome of that, and dealing with very fired up people who wanted a state of their own, and were hoping for a degree of Arab unity, across the northern Middle East. So that was a tough challenge. Funnily enough, of course, or funny, but the strange thing was, I suppose, that Britain actually ended up dealing with the consequences of that first, because it was the British who tried to impose government, a sort of a foreign government, on Iraq first, and then faced the reaction from that. But it was the French who then spent much of the 1920s fighting this sort of slow burning war in Syria against the Druze and Syrian nationalists, who got a lot of their support from inside British territory, and that is a very interesting. It's a very interesting story, and it forms a sort of chunk of the middle part of a line in the sand.
Yeah.
And this big question about, were the British helping them? What was actually going on? It's
Yeah.
it's a strange story, and it contributes to the sort of the embitterment of Anglo-French relations during that time.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Iraq, and I wanted to pick up on it because the other aspect of the whole story is that the borders and mandates and treaties and other legal instruments, they're just, first of all, they're lines on a page, but actually turning that into a geographical reality, a geopolitical reality, is much harder. It requires the application of serious and sustained violence. So we talk about Iraq. You look at Iraq in 1920, you have this uprising, the Sunni, the Shia, the Kurdish rebels. They have this uprising against British rule in favor of what you talked about, this independent Arab government that they've been talking about. And in order to repress it, it required tens of thousands of troops. It required British air power. It required, of course, Winston Churchill advocating the use of chemical weapons. And then at the end of it all, they're still forced to give this mandate more autonomy and to install Faisal I as the king.
Exactly. I mean, this is, in a sense, it's quite it's a familiar story, because the British didn't have any money at the end of the war. They were, bankrupt, but certainly could not afford this kind of sort of colonial adventure. And there were plenty of people in Britain who felt that they might have been pro-empire, but they felt that the empire was quite big enough already. Thanks very much. Even with the prospect of oil, which of course was what had drawn the British in. It was, towards the end of even if Sykes-Picot, or Sykes, when he was negotiating this deal, of course, gave France the area where most of the sort of northern Iraqi oil fields are. He didn't care about oil. It wasn't really within his sort of purview at all. He wasn't told to worry about that. He was just thinking of strategically about protecting India. And it was only in 1918 that the British suddenly thought, oh, there's oil here, and if we could get hold of this, that would be good. And the reason they did that, the reason it suddenly became important, was because the Anglo-American relationship was also becoming very prickly. And America had supplied most of the oil during the First World War, but was obviously increasingly anti-imperialist itself. And the President, Woodrow Wilson, was making more and more strident comments about the way that imperialism had caused the war. And the British thought, we need oil from elsewhere, and it was Iraq that was going to supply it. So right at the end of the war, of course, the British, who'd been in Baghdad, they'd been following the letter of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but right at the end of the war, after the armistice had been signed, they steamed north. They took Mosul to give themselves control over that oil-bearing part of Iraq, what is now Iraq. And essentially to override the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But they then faced, as you said, they faced enormous uproar. They weren't wanted. They were very slow to sort of see the signs of that, and the administrators on the spot were, I suppose, trying to. Well, they thought that it would be very hard to get oil investment if there was an Arab government in place, because would have been a novelty, which I suppose you can say is, that wasn't an unreasonable thing, but underlying that was this basic.
Well, James, I mean, I think maybe saying it was not an unreasonable thing might be.
I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. I'm feeling generous. I'm feeling generous this afternoon. But
I think that generosity is warranted after the.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think ultimately it was racism. The basic belief was these people have got no experience of governing themselves, or not, within the last 500 years, and they're not going to start doing that now. In the same way that the French felt they lost a lot in the war, the British also were thinking, how do we recoup our position? And Iraq bore the brunt of that.
I want us to come to the American entry into the region. But before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about writing history. So we had Eugene Rogan, professor of modern Middle Eastern history at Oxford, on the show a few weeks ago, and he talked about how he writes history in a very personal, human-focused way. And I hope you'll take it as a compliment when I say that your own storytelling style in the books are much the same. On the one hand, the story you tell in these books has this big geopolitical scope, but at the same time, it's told through the eyes of the individuals who drove it. And I wondered why you thought to take that particular approach.
I think because it's accessible. That's the honest answer. And I think
Mm.
there are plenty of people out there who would say, beware overstressing the role of individuals or, great men, I suppose.
Yeah,
And it's, that's something I am aware of and wary about. At the same time, what one is trying to do is to sort of personalize and as far as possible, rather than talking about, abstract forces,
mm.
as far as you can, is to try to to tell the story through people, but not least because a lot of these people are extraordinary, often very flawed, and they say the most extraordinary things, which are very well documented in the 20th century archives.
So there's
What
a
I
sort of
find
yeah, go ahead.
what I find now, so now I'm working on a book that has a much wider scope. So I'm starting in about 600 BC and hopefully coming quite close to the present day, but without writing a book that's hopefully much longer than the previous books have been. So there'll be inevitably less space to focus on individuals, and also one has to bring in big forces like climate into it, because clearly when you stand back a long way, you can see that in periods like the 17th century or around the sort of the collapse of the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC, that there are climatic factors. The question, I suppose, is rather than writing about them in a fairly dry and abstract way, whether one can fold them into to individual stories.
Yeah.
that becomes that becomes a lot harder. The further back you go, the less evident, or the less really sort of grainy material you have to work with, so
Yes.
it gets harder as a technique.
It gets hard to find those illustrative quotes that make the person real. Yeah.
That's right,
And one
exactly.
figure I thought you brought to life particularly well is, of course, we've talked about the architect, Mark Sykes himself, and he was a very colorful character. So I wondered if you could give us a flavor of that color of those quotes. This man who he shares so much responsibility for the way the Middle East looks today, but he wasn't a politician in the way that he wasn't a serious politician by any stretch.
He wasn't at all. He was somebody who sort of found himself in the right place at the right time, and he came from a well-known um, sort of. I mean, they were the baronets. The family still exists. There's sort of two branches of it, and one branch has its family seat in Yorkshire, in a rather grand house that I've been to a few years back.
Oh,
And actually going there is quite interesting, because they've clearly, as a family, got a sense of humor, and it's unlike most stately homes that you go round, because there's just little flashes of humor in there. And in one room, I remember you see it's a sort of a standard sort of grand house with lots of dark brown furniture and so on. But in one room there was a small toy car perched on one of these sort of chests of drawers or something like that, with a little sort of child's toy car with a fox sitting in it. Sort of slight sort of what's the word? A kind of subversion of what you'd expect to see in these sorts of places. But Sykes grew up in that house, and he had a very weird upbringing. His father was quite old when he married. He was married to Sykes's mother was about half Sykes's father's age. She had repeated affairs. Sykes was an only child, but when he was about 11 years old, he went to Egypt for the first time, and he was obviously entranced by it. And he then returned there repeatedly as a young man,
hmm.
and ended up with a job as an attaché at the British Embassy in Istanbul. So he had sort of struggled to find regular employment, I think we could say. He went to university, he went to Cambridge, but he never managed to take his degree. He just didn't quite have the sort of the staying power. And so he ends up in Istanbul and as an honorary attaché, and then he made a series of, I mean, it's really basically, adventurous tourism across the region in the era before the First World War, and that was how he made his name. So in 1915, just as the whole question of what to do about the Middle East arises, he had published a book called The Caliph's Last Heritage. I think it's a big, thick doorstopper of a tome, and it was that he was able to sort of, to kind of hold up and say, look, I know what I'm talking about. But the strange thing was, and I need to be careful here, not being total hypocrite, because I don't either, but he sort of made himself out to be a great expert, and he made it. And interestingly, one of the things that comes across is that when he went to the cabinet meeting where he put his grand idea for how to sort of fix the Middle East and draw the lines. One of the cabinet ministers who was sitting there listening to him wrote to somebody else after the meeting that Sykes obviously could speak Turkish and Arabic. Well, the reality is that he couldn't speak either of those two languages, so he was a bit of a bullshit artist, I think would be the way to put it. There would have been the odd phrase dotted in those languages, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the
And
inshallah of its day.
yes, exactly, alhamdulillah, and sort of, it's that kind of thing. And it was enough to persuade people who really knew nothing about the subject, and frankly for whom it was a bit of a diversion. The British politicians at that time had a lot else to worry about. Sykes gave the impression of being all over the details on this, and so they were very happy to wave him off with his scheme and tell him to sort out the problem and to reach a deal with Francois Georges Picot, the French negotiator. So yes, it was it was probably an unwise choice. Whether someone else would have come up with a different scheme is an interesting question, because there were other powerful forces involved. There were the thing. This is where the angle comes in. Sykes eventually took a plan to India, and effectively the British officials in India rewrote it. And when Sykes then proposed that line in end of 1915, in some ways what he was doing was repeating, what it was that the government of India were telling him to do.
I wonder how you feel about some of these figures, having researched them and eavesdropping across time on their stories and their family histories and their conversations, because a lot of them, I mean, so much of British foreign policy at the time, some would say still, determined by the kind of peculiar idiosyncratic notions of these figures. But it also strikes me as being, well, maybe I should just ask you the question before I editorialize on it. How do you feel about some of these figures?
I think they're both interesting, and in some ways, quite say attractive. What I mean by that is, I would love to meet Mark Sykes were he alive today. I'd be fascinated to meet him, because I know that it would be an interesting meeting. He'd have a lot to say. I'm sure. Not whether one would get a word in edgeways is another matter, but it would be very, very interesting to meet him. At the same time that I feel that someone like him is someone who I wouldn't get on with. I would, personally, I think his approach to things, his sort of his prejudices and whatever, it would it would be a strange meeting. That said, you've got to be very careful with all this, that one brings a sort of 21st century sensitivity to people who lived 100 years ago, who had very different views and views that we would recoil at today about all kinds of stuff.
Do you ever feel, do you ever feel that you are perhaps too forgiving towards some of these figures, given what they did?
I don't know. That's a very good question. Do you think so? Maybe I think probably from a for anybody else, and particularly if you're not British or French, that you would say perhaps this is uh too forgiving, too generous, I suppose. But what I'm trying to do is the danger is that one could be much more angry. One could sort of attack these people more. I think I'm fairly harsh on people like Sykes. I think if reading the description of Sykes at the beginning of A Line in the Sand, I don't think people would come away thinking that I thought he was a great guy. But at the same time, I'm trying to understand them and I'm trying to explain. I think that that's the crucial job of history, is not to criticize and not to um, to sort of bash people with what we think of what our standards today, but to explain what they were doing and why they were doing it.
But
And
the
to,
standards, yeah, James, the
and
standards. Sorry, the standards are not questions about the way they spoke. The standards are about their politics. So this isn't a question of 100 years ago people had different views about other races. This is a question of people imposing political will on other nations. That isn't something that has changed over the years. That is
no,
something that we would have thought was bad then and we think is bad today.
well, that's but not everyone did. I think that's the thing. I think at that time, a lot of people thought that was a perfectly fair thing to do because they believed that British standards were, the British were very civilized and could help other people who were less fortunate, and help them on their way. And I think today you'd say it's hypocritical, or at least, and it certainly it was disingenuous, because in most cases it was simply a case of getting hold of the resources. The promises that were made when the mandates were granted it was always about leading people to being able to govern themselves. But of course, in Palestine that didn't happen until the British were kicked out, and it only really happened in Iraq again because of force. So yeah,
There's
I
a
mean,
sort of there's a sort of self-serving argument there, isn't there? Because it isn't the case that these countries and communities needed to be saved or needed to be governed. They had civilizations and countries and nations and empires of their own. So the idea that they were somehow this community in the mountains and they needed civilizing is really very disingenuous. Quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah, you're right, because it's very interesting. I was just reading the proclamation that General Maud made when he entered Baghdad in 1917, yesterday, in fact.
Hmm.
And of course, it shows this, and it was drafted, I think, by Sykes himself, and it makes great play of history, and it's this appeal to the Arabs, telling them that Britain was hoping that they would be able to unify, regain freedom, that they had been living under, foreign government for, I think, 26 generations is the phrase that gets used. So,
Hmm.
I mean, thinking to the Mongol era, I suppose, sort of basically the collapse of the Abbasids. And so, so the strange thing is that the British sort of weaponize this history. They know full well that there is, there was a glorious era, in Arab history, but they, you know, and they, in theory, they pay lip service to it, but the reality is that in 1920 they take over, or 1918
Hmm.
they take over, and there is no real space for any kind of independent government, that we of a type that we'd recognise today.
And
Yeah,
then lastly on this topic, I think I should ask: are you sensitive to the criticism that perhaps you are trying to explain what the imperial powers were doing rather than seeking to explain the effect of it on the people of that region?
yeah, I am aware of that, and in a sense, I don't claim that the book is a history of the Middle East. I think some people have sort of said this is a brilliant history of the Middle East or whatever, and I never set out to do that. I've taken the sources, the archives that I've got, and tried to explain what the imperialist powers were doing. But the books do not tell the story of how that felt. partly because there isn't the same level of very, very contemporary detail. There's quite a few memoirs of Arab politicians, but what I try to use when I can is the sources that are absolutely from the moment. And if I can avoid later, particularly memoirs, which I think are really, often very, very dangerous sources, historic, from a historian's point of view, because they're written with hindsight, they're written to justify and all that sort of stuff. The difficulty is can you find the sort of the sort of sources that show actually what people really felt at that moment in time. But I have to say, that wasn't what I was trying to do with the Line in the Sand. I wasn't trying to write a history of a whole history of the Middle East, of the experience of people who were living under French and British rule was like. I was just trying to explain this great power rivalry with the Middle East as its arena.
Yeah. Well, let's move on then to talk about the relationship with America. The Americans become a major force in the region after World War II, just as the French are forced to leave Syria. And as had been the case between the British and the French after the First World War, the Americans and the British, who are ostensibly allies, they have mutually exclusive visions for the Middle East. And in the opening pages, you quote a conversation between the then British Prime Minister Anthony Eden and the notoriously hard right MP Enoch Powell, who comes to prominence a little bit later in British public imagination.
Yes.
And Powell was explicit with Eden that this is a quote, "In the Middle East, our greatest enemies are the Americans." And that runs counter to popular impressions of the British and American relationship, I think. So I wonder if you can briefly explain what the two powers' interests in the Middle East were at the time, and then what was it that made them irreconcilable?
So I think if you were going to try and sum that up, those two interests very briefly, it would be that the British interest, well, the British were trying to cling on, and the Americans were trying to barge in. I think that would be the dynamic of it. And well, it's over two things. I mean, it's over trade and then over oil, and those are the two big factors. Even before America's support for Israel becomes a real factor,
right?
And by the middle of the Second World War, the British were thinking, well, our main base now is Suez. That is the strategically the most important place we have to control. It would be great if there was a ring of allied Arab states, or maybe one Arab state to its east, to protect the approaches to the Suez from the Russian kind of angle. And that cut across American thinking, because the Americans were by then thinking about how they could develop their oil interest in Saudi Arabia. And of course, they had won the oil concession there in the 30s, found oil in about 1938. And so they were keen to develop Saudi. And once the war was over, the thing that they were very keen to do was to get Saudi oil and get it to Europe to help fuel European reconstruction. And this then became the major source of friction between the British and the Americans, because the British had been the top, even though they hadn't got the oil concession, they were the top dog in Saudi Arabia during the 40s. They'd even managed to use American lend-lease aid. They'd sort of repackaged it and given the Saudis money, which the Americans were absolutely incandescent about. The Americans came up with this idea of building the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, and that was going to ship Saudi oil to the Med and make it competitive compared to Iranian oil, which of course was under British control. So there's this big commercial rivalry. So the British did their utmost to try to slow down the construction of this pipeline, and that is a fantastic example of the kind of what was going on under the surface between Britain and America in the early years after the Second World War.
Well, actually, that is what I wanted to conclude the conversation by talking a bit about these imperial rivalries, because it seems to me, I mean, both books in a way are about imperial rivalry, but you could also think that they're about imperial folly. You start a line in the sand with the Ottomans on the way out and the British on the way in, and then you finish Lords of the Desert with the British on the way out and the Americans on the way in. And I wondered if if you're looking at America's current fortunes, you could perhaps imagine the events of the past decade as a chapter in a hypothetical third book in the trilogy, with the Americans on the way out, and, well, we don't yet know who's on the way in.
That's the thing. It doesn't sort of fit quite so, I suppose, so neatly. I mean,
No.
the thing is, I mean, with both these books, I'm trying to tell one story, and you could argue that there are other factors involved in at this time in both those, but in the periods the books cover. But yes, I mean, well, it is folly, and it is this sort of belief that that we can do better. When the British arrived in Palestine in 1917, the newspaper editorials sort of spoke of how they were going to bring a new era of kind of joy and happiness and solve ancient problems. The British common sense would find a way, and you read it now, and it's ridiculous, and it probably sounded ridiculous even then to people who knew anything about the depths of and the complexity of the problems. Although, of course, they got worse as a result of Britain's sponsorship of the Balfour Declaration. But yes, I mean, it's I suppose and that's the big difference. The big difference. For Britain today is I don't think we don't go around the world with those, with that sort of, I mean, self-confidence is the most positive way of putting it. But, that self-belief that leads you to think that, you can tell other people what to do in the same way.
Mm.
And that I suppose, that is what's happened with the United States, that, there was, of course, after 2003, this great, belief that, that American ways and means would change Iraq. There's, it's beautifully chronicled, all these very early part of the story is beautifully told by Raju Chandrasekaran in his book. Oh gosh, the title escapes me, but something in the Emerald City. It's the book about America's occupation of Iraq immediately after the 2003 war, and how there were sort of people with flip charts and management consultants there and all the rest. And it's hubris, and it looked like that even very soon after the event, and possibly even at the time. But now it's even more like hubris.
Much more, yeah. And I imagine in 100 years, people like us will be saying the same thing. Like, you can't believe that they thought that at the time.
I think that's right, and yet yet people manage to, and they manage to do that repeatedly. People do believe they can somehow, this time it will be different. And with us, we can solve this.
I wanted to finish by sharing a quote from Edward Said about this. And in his book Culture and Imperialism, he wrote, this is the quote: "It is quite common to hear high officials in Washington and elsewhere speak of changing the map of the Middle East, as if ancient societies and myriad peoples can be shaken up like so many peanuts in a jar." And I think when it's put like that, it really does seem like quite a ridiculous notion to hold on to, and these beliefs to have. Why do you think these successive great powers, as we've just said, the British 100 years ago, the Americans in 2003, why do you think that these great powers continue to believe it's an achievable goal?
It's sort of, the kind of triumph of hope over experience, I suppose. I struggle to answer it. Because I think if you do read the history and think about it, you would say, well, how are we going to be different? How are we going to manage to resolve something that was clearly unresolvable, but certainly requires deep thought? And if we pile into a place where we really change it for the better, I don't think I don't think people do read enough or don't think enough about how the story might be about other people. It might be about Britain and France 100 years ago, but it has a direct relevance to anybody thinking of doing the same thing today.
James Barr, thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal.
You can buy both of James's books, A Line in the Sand and Lords of the Desert, in all good bookshops. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. You can subscribe to the New Lines magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.